Okay, so this video we're going to look at Mao's Cultural Revolution. It's good to think of it as a communist revolution number 2 in China. Mao's Great Leap Forward was so bad that although he wasn't removed from power, his influence was much less. And he decided that if he did a second revolution, his power would increase.
Mao Zedong Wansui lived 10,000 years.
In 1966, Mao Zedong had a problem.
Older picture of Mao.
A Chinese leader who had led a peasant army to victory in the Chinese Civil War and established the Communist People's Republic of China in 1949 was getting old. Worse, his radical policies had devastated the country and triggered the deadliest famine known to human history.
Facts.
By the early 1960s, Mao's once great influence and public presence were at an all-time low. And there were rumors that he was dying, or even dead already. He needed to find a way to seal his legacy as the face of Chinese communism, and a new revolution to lead.
A lot of times leaders are worried about their legacy. When they're getting to the end of their time in office, they start thinking of how will history remember them. Many leaders tend to think of that.
It started in a river. The Great Leap Forward was a disaster. It was Mao's 1958 plan to quickly industrialize China by working its massive peasant population non-stop.
He promises to transform the People's Republic into an instant paradise through the sheer force of numbers,
forcing workers in the countryside to farm crops on government-run communes.
These are great primary sources.
And millions more to manufacture crude steel.
There's the backyard steel. Imagine the type of steel you're going to get from that.
In homemade blast furnaces.
It's going to be bad. That's going to be awful.
Even though Mao told the world that the plan was succeeding,
everywhere the communists report, production records are being broken.
The truth was much more desperate.
They flood the fields, exhaust the soil, and farm production, instead of going up, goes down.
The Chinese people were being forced to work tirelessly on land they once owned themselves.
Look at that. So they're farming without heavy machinery. Everything is done by people power. Not even heavy machinery, just masses and masses of people.
And they were starting to lose morale. And despite reports of widespread famine with millions of people starving to death, Mao kept production quotas high.
The pace grows more frantic. Ceaselessly without rest, one observer writes, the countryside is in convulsion.
Mao's Great Leap Forward ended in 1962. By that time, somewhere between 23 and 55 million people had died in the famine.
Or that to move water, to irrigate the fields, just people power, not even machinery.
Over in the Soviet Union, a different political upheaval was happening. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who Mao modeled himself after, was dead. And Mao watched as Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, implemented a period known as de-Stalinization, where Khrushchev set out to reverse many of Stalin's policies and dismantle the personality cult that had formed around him.
There's, just as an aside, there's two parts of the USSR communists. There's the Stalin part, a horrible mass murder, absolute dictator, totalitarian. And then there was the time after Stalin where the Communist Party rejected Stalin.
Mao saw his own legacy potentially suffering the same fate. His communist revolution was long over, and his ideas weren't taken as seriously after the disaster of the Great Leap Forward.
Now you're going to hear him use the word disaster. Obviously that's biased, but it is backed up by the consensus. I mean, everyone, all historians agree it was a disaster. So obviously it's an opinion, but it's backed up by a lot of facts.
It was starting to look like Mao's place in the pantheon of powerful communist figures.
Lenin, Karl Marx, Mao Zedong,
like Vladimir Lenin and Karl Marx, was in peril. This is where the river comes in. Mao had a reputation for being a strong swimmer, and even used it as a symbol of his ideology. In 1956, he swam across China's biggest river, the Yangtze, in 3 highly publicized swims to demonstrate that big things like US imperialism didn't intimidate him.
Okay, that's one way to show that you're strong against the United States is go for a swim. I'm sure there's more to it than that.
10 years later, Mao took on the Yangtze again to dispel rumors of his failing health, this time with cheering crowds swimming alongside him. He brought his personal photographer, who snapped this photo of the aging dictator in the river, and another one showing Mao waving to his fellow swimmers with the landmark Wuhan Yangtze River Bridge behind him, an iconic architectural achievement of the communist government and proof that he was at the Yangtze. The swim made the front page of China's state newspaper, reporting that Mao swam around 15 kilometers, a little more than 9 miles, in a span of 65 minutes.
That's impossible.
Which meant the 72-year-old would have shattered world speed records.
Of course he did.
A lot of people outside of China laughed at the outlandish story, but some saw the swim for what it was, a sinister sign, pointing out that Mao's swims from a decade earlier preceded the catastrophic Great Leap Forward. Experts feared that Mao was on the verge of kicking off another disastrous period of turmoil in China.
He was.
They were right. 2 months before the swim, Mao had announced the beginning of his great proletarian cultural revolution, a call to hunt down and eliminate the bourgeoisie who had sneaked into the party, basically to purge the government of anyone who strayed from principles of Maoism. And it kicked into high gear after his historic swim, which prompted a craze for swimming in China, but more importantly, a craze for Mao.
Okay, so the idea was that the Communist Party had lost its way. I remember one of his famous quotations: "To learn revolution is to make revolution." So he's going to target a whole new generation of communists and say it's time to learn about revolution by making another revolution. He's creating enemies, and the enemies are those who don't believe in communists enough, those who lost the way, and he's going to target them. Interesting point too. I can't tell you for sure, but one of swimming in the Olympics is very highly prized in China, even today. Gymnastics and swimming. China is one of the big swimming countries where competitive swimming is very highly valued. Now, does this have anything to do with Mao and his swimming, or the craze that it started? I don't know.
Especially among the group that Mao wanted to influence the most, China's youth.
The youth,
Writer
yep.
Wang Heng recalled that seeing Mao as human flesh and blood after the Yangtze swim resolved him to serve him with all his heart. Millions of Chinese youth organized into the fanatical Red Guards, a paramilitary force concentrated mostly in Chinese cities.
Oh, that's scary. Red for communism, but anytime you have youth and the words paramilitary, almost military, I mean, we see this over and over. When you have people acting like the military and they're not the military, oh, Jesus, it's scary.
And with Mao's blessing, they wreaked havoc in the name of cultural revolution. Their mission was to destroy the four olds.
Old culture, old ideology, old customs, old traditions.
And a lot of people are going to say that's a shame. A lot of the old Chinese culture, ideas, customs, traditions, come out of culture now. They're attacked.
All of the olds must be destroyed.
The idea was basically to tear down the vestiges of imperial China and rewrite history centered around Mao Zedong, renaming buildings and streets, destroying cultural sites, and violently humiliating and often torturing and murdering anyone they accused of opposing Mao's ideas, which they plastered all over the cities.
And this is 2,000 years. China is the fourth oldest culture in the world, and the amount of traditions that are just being ignored is unbelievable. Or not ignored, but destroyed.
And carried in their pockets in the form of Mao's Little Red Book, a collection of his sayings and principles. And although the violent Red Guards were basically dissolved by 1969, the Cultural Revolution is considered to have continued until Mao's death in 1976.
They say it got so out of control that Mao had to put a stop to it. So it was a cultural revolution stopped by the word of Mao because even he was scared of how out of control it was getting.
Ending a decade of destruction that had elevated the leader to godlike levels and resulted in over 1 million people dead. The chaos of the Cultural Revolution scarred China for generations, but Mao basically got what he wanted. Even though the Chinese Communist Party condemned the Cultural Revolution in 1981, and Chinese communism diverted away from Maoism, they didn't denounce Mao himself. The Cultural Revolution solidified Mao's cult of personality, and that influence has lasted.
So as Stalin was erased, Mao remains in memory.
Mao's swim, which is still commemorated each year in China, was more than a display of strength. It was a message to get behind Mao as he began his last revolution.
Excellent. Excellent video. And if we go today, let's go in. We get Tiananmen Square with the picture of Mao still hanging on it. See ya.